Hi podcasters, it's Rich here. This week we're revisiting one of our earliest episodes and it's our deep dive into Bliss Revisited. It's a project really close to mine and TA's hearts, and this chat takes us back to when we first reread the script after nearly a decade, and of course to season 1 of the podcast. Next week we'll be bringing you another brand new bonus podcast as TA and I revisit Bliss in a how we do it now situation, so consider this your warm-up act.
It's the Middle-aged Bodcast. Getting older, but having some laughs.
So welcome everybody to episode 3 of the Middle-aged Bodcast with me, Raging Rich.
And me, T.A. Shelano.
And TA, today we're going to be talking about a collaboration on a script that we wrote called Bliss Revisited from a few years ago. So this should be an interesting one.
Yeah, I think so. I'm really looking forward to it, Rich. It's a shame that the listeners couldn't have been here about 10, 15 minutes ago, where we went through the script having not read it for a number of years and talking about our observations of that.
So to kick off this retrospective on Bliss Revisited, I suppose we should talk a little bit about the inspiration that we had behind it. And for me, certainly I can equate two things. I know one of them is a shared love of the British version of The Office. And certainly Ricky Gervais, the star of the show. And I think from my point of view also, the movies of Kevin Smith, especially those early ones, so Clerks, Mallrats, Chasing Amy, certainly took a lot of inspiration from that as to why certainly I wanted to write a film. So how about yourself, TA?
Yeah, I think so. And I agree. I think the shared inspiration at that time, I think we're talking about this now, we have to obviously look back to the era in which this was and how we were drawing inspiration as obviously much younger people from things that we sort of were watching, and that kind of motivation that gives you around wanting to do something yourself creative and go through a creative process, which you and I did.
And we should point out that this was written originally, I mean, so many years ago. In fact,
I think 2005.
I think it was, yeah, and I think that's around the time Leona Lewis won the X Factor, because I'm pretty sure that was the year we went, this is the concept. So just to kind of describe the film in a nutshell, really, it's the story of Jason Maxwell, who is the former manager of a girl band called Bliss, who were once the biggest girl band in Britain. They'd split up around 5 or so years prior to the setting of the film. And everything that Jason had earned while he was managing the group essentially was gone. He'd lost all of his money, he'd lost all of his resource. He was just living with his parents after having all this sort of living the high life. That was all gone, and he was desperate to reclaim that. And after a bit of his parents kind of making fun of him and the people around him making fun of him, he just decides he's going to get that back, and he's going to essentially bring Bliss back together and go for the Christmas #1, which sort of became the focal point then of the film.
Yeah, and I think we kind of looked at it in terms of bringing this sort of story together with cultural references of that time, and things that sort of work in terms of the humour that you and I both like, and integrating that into it. What I would say is the script that we produced, which has over the years has been sort of tweaked, albeit not for a long time, was relatively short scripts. So they were kind of outlines that could fit into episodes if it was an actual TV series, or if it was a short film, you'd expand it out. So it's almost like a finished, unfinished product.
I think that's right. And I think the biggest thing for me was constantly having to change some of those references. There would be something every time that would change. You know, a judge would change on the X Factor, or a certain celebrity would become famous and be used as sort of one of the jokes or something like that. Kind of like how there's certain references in The Office that we get because of the time, whereas if somebody was to watch it now for the first time, they'd probably ask, well, who are some of these people that are being referenced?
Yeah, it's very conscious of that, having literally just read the script back with you, having not seen it for a long time. That does come across, and there are certain references in it where we're then talking about, oh, what was that at that time, and what was that about? So it's interesting how things age, which was an interesting part of it. But I think the other thing around it, especially being involved in this collaboration on the podcast, is our own processes around creativity and planning, and how the difference between doing that perhaps in your early 20s versus your early 40s is quite an interesting observation for us to look back on as well. I'm not going to say that you and I are both, very experienced procrastinators, but we'll get more into that later on.
I think the other thing is the resources around us. So with filmmaking, if you think back to when we wrote it, we're talking nearly 20 years ago, and you think that YouTube wasn't really as big as it is now. There were people who were doing videos on how to do filming with, digital video cameras that weren't really phones, whereas now you can film something on your phone in 4K, which is phenomenal. Whereas back then, if you remember my old digital video camera that I bought off like a TV shopping channel, and it had like a 32 meg memory card in it, and now you can just get a phone and you could film realistically. You could film like an hour or more in 4K, which is incredible. And I think that's a testament to how things have changed in that timeline. Mention YouTube. There was a channel I was watching at the time about how to make movies and how to do special effects. I remember somebody showing you how to essentially do Spider-Man climbing up a wall, or how to do throwing somebody through glass by making your own sugar glass and things like that. But now you think what's available on YouTube and even like this podcast and what we've gained in knowledge from that, it's light years ahead of where it was back then.
I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this, is in terms of if you were sitting down today, so if we were that age then now doing this, the options available to you from a creative point of view are so much greater than what was there at the time. I mean, again, taking the fact anything to do with the writing process or the quality of the writing, which we might come to, in terms of the actual idea of you and I writing it, and then I think wanting to kind of produce that as a somehow short film production would be a much easier, not easy, but easier option today than it was certainly during the time when we looked at this.
If you think about YouTube videos, just bringing it back to that again, look at the vloggers that there are now. Look at people who go on location to places and they film something. They've got professional microphones, they've got somebody filming them, they've got audio all produced well, they've got the video quality is phenomenal. I've mentioned in the past to you the Sidemen and their video production values, and it's incredible when you look at that. And I think that you mentioned if we were the age we were 20 years ago when we wrote this, I think if that were us now but at that age, yes, there'd be so much more opportunity to do things with it, and certainly it would make a lot of things easier to do. I think at one point we were discussing getting a microphone, attaching it to my little digital video camera, and running around with a broomstick attached to the microphone, so we had like a boom mic and things like that, which just would not have worked really at the time.
No, I think that's it. The thing about it as well is you were always very conscious on the technical side of things and the limitations that we had, and that not wanting to almost ruin a project by delivering something with the limited resources we had that really wouldn't have looked very good. And if we were doing that today, the options to make it look better are far greater than anything that was available at that time. So I think that is definitely an interesting observation. But again, I imagine if you were to sit down with people who perhaps were looking at something 10, 20 years before we were, and then how more limited it was even then at that time, it's just how things evolve.
It's really interesting because I met Amber Benson, who was in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and she'd started doing some independent film, and I remember talking to her at a convention. And I actually said to her, me and my friend have written this film. We just wanted a bit of advice. And her advice was, shoot it. Just shoot the film. And we never did that. And I think part of that was I don't want to say I didn't think the quality of the project wasn't good enough, because it would have been, but the video quality, I just wasn't happy with what we had at the time. And I think, would it have mattered in the grand scheme of things? Maybe not. But when you look, especially now at videos on YouTube, it wouldn't have been what it could be now. You know, there are videos that can be uploaded now and in 10, 20 years time would still look phenomenal. Whereas I think if you go back to those early days of YouTube, you'd really find it awkward to watch some of that content.
The only thing I would say is, even when you look at things that have been professionally made, one of the things that I notice now more and more, when you look back, even at stuff that was on television that was filmed in the 80s and the 90s, when you look at the quality and how the time looks compared to when you watch something today, even in a professional environment, that still shows. So I think the thing, or the regret from our point of view, is if we had just done that, even with the very limited options available to us, we would actually be able to sit here the best part of 20 years later saying, yeah, okay, it doesn't look good compared to what you can do today. But that's because of the time it was in. But what we also would have done is captured what we'd written in the era it was written in, which would have made more sense. Because actually, when you look back at the script now, that's one of the issues where if you don't do something at a given time, it ages. There's still some great things in there that are timeless, but there are other things in there that don't work because society's moved on, time's moved on. But we would have captured something at a given moment in time, and that's not what we ended up doing, unfortunately.
I think on top of that, if we're talking about who would have been in the film, and that's something we would have potentially had to have just our friends being in it. We did look at the potential of getting local actors to maybe be a part of it, but then you've got to think you need to pay them. And if you're not paying them, give them an incentive to be a part of it. And I know we said we could maybe take them for a meal at the end of the production or something like that. But thinking about it now, that wouldn't really have been a sufficient reward for the amount of effort that would have been there. I do think that now with the technology that's available to us, actually you could quite easily film somebody who can't sing and make them a good singer and things like that. So there is potential there. Certainly if you were to make it today, that's an improvement on what was there 20 odd years ago. But as you say, it would have been nice to have had something captured that kind of, you do watch something like The Office even now, which we've referenced as a big inspiration to us, and it is very much an of its time to a certain level when you watch it and you sort of go, well, it's not something that's been filmed today. Some of those references, like blockbusters, for example, in one of the episodes, and things wouldn't catch on. So I think that's very similar in this film.
I think the other thing that we have to confront in this is, do we have enough talent? You talk about sort of having people come and support and collaborate with us, but in terms of convincing people with the script that we had, was that good enough? I think that's the thing when you get to look back, and we have, as we said, reread it just before doing this podcast, and you do look back and there's things that I still really like. There is still some great lines in there. I'd forgotten some of the song lyrics that we'd wrote, and some of those things, they're not as bad as some of them stand the test of time. So I think it's one of those things as well where we would have had an opportunity potentially, had we been more determined, as you say, more confident, we'd have been able to get into that whole rewriting process, the collaboration process, the technical process, that we would then have naturally improved. And that because we didn't do it, you don't get the opportunity to learn from that failing in that way, which is a shame. But I think that the thing we've probably learned over time and doing other things, since, is that if we commit to these sort of things, that we can do something. I do look back at it and think, we could have done more that would have made it better. But I still look back at it and think, actually, the outline of what we've done and some of it was actually not in a bad place. It did need work, but that was achievable. And I suppose it's a question of, if it was something we were to look at again today, how you would again look at that and improve that. And would we be able to improve that now looking back retrospectively?
I think there'd be a lot of improvements that could be made. But I actually think media has changed a lot as well. And I've spoken to you in the past about audiobooks. There's a lot of audiobooks now that are actually fully casted audio dramas. And maybe that's the way to go about it, because you don't have to worry about finding a location to film in that matches something. You don't have to dress a set You don't have to get a load of people to all be in the same room at the same time. You can very easily record dialogue and other audio. And with the technology, again, as we've said, around creating a crowd noise, for example, of the showcase that we have at the end of the film, you know, that kind of thing is very much there. And I think that would be what I would do a little bit differently now. Another format, another way of bringing that about. And also you could make it more episodic. It could be one giant audio book, but you could split it into chapters, and so then you've got a way to just make it manageable to listen to for people.
One of the interesting things, just looking at certain things at the moment around on the writing side, you know, with the book, is how people do short stories. So I think in terms of what you've said there around having like short audio clips almost, you know, if we were to go back, tighten that script up, you know, in terms of then developing that, you could break it down into segmented audio episodes. And as you say, you then cut back on costs and that need as well to deliver something visual, and actually just have it as a sound thing, almost like an old version of a tape. A tape, for anybody under the age of 25 who's listening, it used to be a media format that was quite popular in historic times. But that sort of listening to things again, actually not everything has to be you know, a visual representation, and that also helps to bring your words to life, but it would put a little bit more pressure on that tightening the script. But I'm certainly confident today that we would be able to do that.
I think so. I think it would be something that's certainly worth looking at again. Just to sort of give a bit of a gist, I suppose, of the story to people, that might be a good idea, because we've spoken a lot about it and obviously mentioned it was about this group going for Christmas #1. The idea at the end was that Jason, the manager of Bliss, was kind of double-crossing them, but then they double-cross him, so they get signed to a deal. I must admit that the version of the script that we read was a rewritten one, and I can't remember why we rewrote the ending so much, but I actually prefer what we had before. I can't really completely remember it, but I think it was a little bit funnier than what we had. I think maybe in terms of a wholesome emotional connection, this maybe is better. I think we wanted it to be more of, I think the original ending, it was more of a fluke that the girls won. Whereas when we got to this point, reading it back, they outsmart Jason. And I think that's part of it as well.
The interesting thing with that is it almost feels ahead of its time, because, you know, we often talk about at the moment in society around misogyny and different things where that was how Jason sort of came across. So the idea that he was outsmarted by people who he thought he was smarter than in the girls is quite an interesting take on it as well, and probably fits quite well for something that was written a while ago in the modern era, which is another thing when you look back at the work, is what works today versus when you've written something and the different rewrites at different points in time, which are all quite a long time ago. But I think the other interesting thing to bring back in this, we did enter you know, a competition around film scripts, and I remember the feedback that we got was not terrible. It was not amazing, but it was not terrible. And it talked about different things that you could do, you know, to improve certain things between characters. And the one thing that will always stick in my mind is that they said that you need to commit to the creative process rather than just the one idea. And I think the interesting thing is, it took us a long time. I did say we were procrastinators earlier on, but we've got to it, is that we've come back at this point much later on in our lives. And here we are talking about doing the podcast, and obviously the novel, and then these projects. So suddenly we have committed, albeit perhaps at a time when we're more mature and actually feel more confident in what we're able to deliver than when we were first looking at this.
I think you're right. I think it is a case of we're more mature, we're more prepared, we have better knowledge, there's more data out there that you can consume that gives you the knowledge on how to do these things that we're trying to do. And certainly for me, I think it's a project that I'm very proud of. And like you say, the feedback was not that bad, and actually some of the character development work we did change slightly based upon some of that feedback as well. So there is something in that, and I think it's probably helped you a lot with the Doctor's Hidden Patients as well, maybe unknowingly, but from that feedback it's probably given you a lot of help with developing the characters for that book and developing that story.
I think it's that acceptance as well, where people offer you constructive feedback and how you take that feedback on board. I've talked a bit in the last episode around where working with people, professionally, can give you advice on the book, where I went away and took what was a 77,000 word first draft and ended up with an 84,000 final version that I feel is much better. And that came from taking that feedback on board, which is part of that rewriting process and being determined. And I think that's perhaps where, if we'd shown more determination for what we were doing at the time and had more belief in what we were doing, we might have got it there, but it wasn't to be. I suppose we also need to, at this point, explain that people are probably thinking, well, I'm fairly sure I've seen something like this around more recently. And if that is the case, I think, Rich, that we can say that we were slightly interested when we saw Meredith Scardino's Girls5Eva, which is available on Netflix. That's not a promo for Netflix, but it is. And saw the similarities in what we'd done and maybe thought, hey, we really should have done it, because then somebody who's won awards has gone and developed a very similar idea to us and delivered it. And that really gave me confidence that actually our idea wasn't bad, and it told me that we really should have had more belief, that that's now a professional show on Netflix. I'm not saying we'd have ever got to that point, obviously, but in terms of, Meredith's, fantastic career versus just me and you as a couple of blokes in Birmingham or whatever. But, it was really interesting that the concept wasn't bad, and that kind of gave me belief and confidence in, we should have more, think more about what, the projects that we do, that they are not bad or may even be good.
I agree with that. I think Girls5Eva is a really good example of something where that concept that we came up with obviously is a concept that works. And actually there was something somebody did as a YouTube series. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was like a boy band version of the Girls5Eva format. It was years ago. It had Keith from The Office in it. But I think with Girls5Eva, and we said it's probably not really for us as a show. I think it certainly has a lot more American humour, and sometimes that doesn't translate over here, like some of our humour doesn't translate over there. And I think that's one of those cases, but it has a fantastic cast. The concepts, as we say, brilliant. It's written by, somebody who's had an absolutely stellar career. And I think what we need to now start thinking about is what can we bring to the table with this concept? And if it were to come back, be that as YouTube short clips or as an audio format or anything like that, what would we do? How would we bring it into a more modern setting? But two, how would we make it different to what's been done with Girls5Eva? How would we sort of make it a more contemporary and realistic view upon things, especially when you think there were shows like The X Factor and that kind of thing around a lot of the time. Now there's The Voice, which is a very different concept and doesn't have that kind of the negative tones that would be on The X Factor sometimes with some of the acts and things.
I think that the point that comes to it with that as well is with Girls5Eva is it does feel quite American, and I do think when you look back at ours, it was very British. So that would be the difference. So Meredith, if you're listening, of course, did you ever want to make a British remake? You know exactly who to turn to. But I think that's probably our take on it, is it was very much written in that way, and they are different in that sense. Despite the cultural crossovers between Britain and the States, really, there are differences there, and ours was very much more with a British reference. I think that's definitely comes across when you read it back.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting time looking back, getting to read the script again. I have enjoyed it, and like you say, it had some really funny lines still that stood the test of time. It had some references where we were questioning, well, what did that mean? It was obviously a pop culture reference from that time. I did like a couple of parts where the girls ask Jason who he's responsible for, and he starts listing off a batch of singers and bands that he had apparently managed, and then at the end claims actually they were all really bad and I had nothing to do with them, and he kind of sticks the knife in a little bit with them there. But it's been a really good time getting to go through it again, getting to read the script again, and I do think that it's something we should revisit, for pardon the pun, in the future and try and bring back.
It's definitely an option on the table. I think if we went to initially a look at tightening it back up, the other thing you could do, you talked about the differences in time. Of course, depending upon how you would look at it, you could record it as set back in time. That is certainly something that I've done with the Doctor's Hidden Patients novel, was to go back in time, and then that helps you if you were trying to characterize an era. You almost become a kind of almost like a historical representation rather than necessarily trying to do something in the modern day. And how you then sell that in terms of to a viewer or a listener is, this is a representation of that time. And there's challenges with that. But again, if you think that that's how your work was best represented versus trying to do too much to make it fit a modern day, there's definitely an element of making that fit, and that's not necessarily unachievable.
I'd agree with that, and I think actually you saying about setting it in a specific time, it's very easy to say. It's a bit similar to the concept of Girls5Eva, but we could actually have it that when we originally wrote the film, that's when they were a girl band. And now they're not a girl band in this modern time. And we've seen a lot of groups in the UK reform. Certainly in the last sort of decade, there's been a number of groups who had success 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they're all reforming. So maybe that is part of the concept, taking some of that, applying our humour to it and bringing that back into the modern day.
Yep, I think that makes perfect sense. So we've given you a bit of a snapshot there back into a joint project between Rage and Rich and T.A. Shelano that would obviously potentially have a real keenness to revisit, revive and revamp even, rather than condemn it to history. Maybe now is the right time. Maybe 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9 was not the right time for this project. Maybe it is today. But I think there's one thing we have missed from today's episode, Rich, which it would be remiss not to raise at this point. Listeners will be interested to know, of course, what is happening with our weekly weigh-in scores.
Oh, of course, yes, the weekly weigh-in. So for anyone who is joining the podcast for the very first time on this episode, T.A. and I are taking part in a bit of a challenge over the course of the series. And so we weighed ourselves at the very beginning. We have not revealed those weights, but we will be revealing what we have lost. And then at the very end, we will be giving you those starting weights and obviously the final weight. So yes, we need to do the weekly weigh-in.
Okay, well, the scores on the doors are T.A. Shelano lost £5.
Fantastic, brilliant. Well done, T.A.
Thank you very much. Probably put it all back on last night, but never mind. Got another few days until the next weigh-in. Raging Rich, weekly weigh-in, lost £7, which is a fantastic achievement. And bearing in mind, our target for the whole series was to lose between half a stone and a stone. Well, Raging Rich is at the beginning of that milestone. He's lost half a stone in the first week. So you're now under a lot of pressure, actually, to keep that off and keep going. If you're going to hit your targets that early, Rich, maybe we should extend the target now. Maybe the target could get a little bit bigger depending on how it goes.
I do think, though, to be honest, we did, when we weighed ourselves in, say the scales could be at fault with some of our weighing, and we had eaten lunch and whatnot. I did certainly change a few things over the course of this week. I would say there's potentially a flaw in the scales. Potentially, I don't think they were completely accurate. So yes, it's saying £7, but we still need to obviously put in this effort. And actually, yesterday I completely went against everything, so I probably put quite a bit back on as well. So it will be an interesting process, and certainly the challenge is not over yet. Both the challenge between us, the forfeit at the end, which may just see me doing a session from the Sean T Insanity program. But yes, I think there's a lot to go. There's a lot of time left, and certainly we need to keep up the progress that we've been making and not keep going back to bad habits like I did yesterday. So yes, a fantastic result, I think, for both of us.
Well, we will obviously keep listeners updated in future episodes as things progress. But at this point, just as a preview for next week's episode 4, Rich and I will be interviewing Laura, who has kindly agreed to come and do a special episode for the podcast about mental health. And we'll be interviewing Laura and talking through her and our own experiences, which we hope will be interesting and helpful for listeners.
Yes, so that should be a really good episode next week. Really looking forward to interviewing Laura. It's going to be a very different episode in terms of it's just been you and I for the last few weeks as well. But yes, really looking forward to it next week. It's going to be a subject that I think a lot of people will find something that they've experienced in as well with their mental health. So hopefully it's going to be of some help to our listeners. Certainly a help to us as well.
Yep, absolutely. Catch you next week.
Yes, thank you for listening to the Middle-aged Bodcast, and we will see you next week for episode 4.
Two best mates here to take you to stand. Rich and T.A. got your health in the hands. Williams, laughs and tales they tell. For beats and nights, the workouts, they're keeping it real. Oh, it's the middle